This is the first Illustrator tutorial that will go over the basic interface and some of the general commands and ways to start setting up files correctly so that as you're working, you are working in the right kind of color space in particular. So Illustrator is part of the Adobe Creative Suite. It is the program that is best used when you're dealing with vector-based files or information. And as everybody probably knows, the difference between vector and raster is that vector is able to scale without losing any sort of resolution. So it's basically a series of relationships between graphic information. And raster-based information is image. It could be most commonly associated with images that have a particular resolution that can scale up and down, but at a certain point you start to lose resolution and the image starts to break down. So Illustrator is best used when you're dealing with line weights, so technical drawings, when you're dealing with graphics, so if you're building a diagram or if you're dealing with text that you want to be able to manipulate in a particular way, as opposed to some of the other Adobe programs like Photoshop that's best for working with images, raster-based images, and InDesign, which is similar to Illustrator in many ways, but more appropriate when you're dealing with something that has a serial setup. So serial, S-E-R-I-A-L, serial, when you're dealing with something like a book or a booklet, when you're working with something that has multiple pages that's meant to be printed. So with that in mind, let's start by opening a new file. So in Illustrator, in Illustrator, new. And it has a series of templates that you can choose from. You can also edit and make your own types of images. What we're doing for this assignment is creating a tabloid-sized, which is 11 by 17, vertically oriented or portrait-oriented image. So I'm going to adjust over here in the details. The width is going to be 11. The height is going to be 17. You'll see that the orientation automatically updates when I've changed those two. Otherwise, I can switch them back and forth if I wanted it to be landscape or horizontally oriented. I want to make sure that my units are in inches. Points and picas are units, increments, units that are used in journalism and print media historically, before digital print or digital programs were used. So it's best to go ahead and set that to inches now. And then the only other thing that you want to set at this point is that your color mode should be set to CMYK. So these are two different ways of creating colors. RGB, if you know much about physics, RGB, red, green, and blue, are the colors that can be combined in multiple combinations to using light to create all of the colors that you may need. And CMYK, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, are pigments that can be used in print media to create any combination of colors. So because our ultimate goal with this assignment is to print your posters out, we're going to use the print color space, which is CMYK. So once you're done with that, hit create, and you'll see your page show up on the pasteboard. So the white is representing your page. In Illustrator, it's referred to as your artboard. And you can set up multiple artboards, but we'll get into that later down the line. And the gray background is what's referred to as your pasteboard. So just so that you're familiar with some of the terminology. You can turn on rulers. So if right now we're just trusting Illustrator that this is the size that we want it to be. But if and I'm using a Mac, so if I say Command, just convert it to Control for anybody using a PC. If I want to turn on the rulers, I can use the shortcut Command R, and so you can see now that there's a series of rulers on the top and the bottom of the page. And that lets me have a visual reference to how big or how small something is. So in terms of the interface, there's a couple of basic things that are important to understand. And there's a couple different workspaces that you can choose from. So Illustrator has a toolbar at the top. It has the basic drop-down toolbar, and this is the same in Mac or PC. These are some basic panels and different types of view. You don't normally need to mess with any of these. What it does have here is our different workspace layouts. So I typically work in Essentials. You can see what happens if you switch over to some of the different workspaces. It'll give you different palettes that you can work from. You're welcome to use whatever you like, but if you're just learning the program, I would recommend for you to match your workspace to mine, in which case you would want to make sure that Essentials is chosen. So artboard, pasteboard, we talked about that. There's a tool palette over here on the left side of the board. You can, in any Adobe program, there's a way to move things around and then dock them in place. So if I take this toolbar and grab it at the top in the dark gray area and hover it towards the left of my my screen, it'll show that blue kind of halo, which means that is asking me basically, do I want to dock it in that area? And I can kind of drop it there. And so now it's in place on the left side, excuse me, and it's not getting in the way of any of my other files. If I had another file open, for example, I'm just going to open a letter file. You can see that I've got tabs here for multiple files. And if I don't have things organized, things can start to get a little bit confusing in terms of what's where. So I recommend working with your tools docked. We only need one file at the moment, so I'm going to close this guy. And if I want to dock this, again, I hover it towards the top, and it will reset it into the background. So we'll go through some of these tools in a minute, but just so you know, there's tools here, the drop downs as I mentioned, and then on the right are what are called panels. These are a series of different sub toolbars, I guess you would call them. It's a panel of information about a particular topic. These are all found, you should see something similar to this when you open up your Illustrator in the Essentials workspace. But if you don't, if at any point you are, or if I'm using a palette that you don't see in your workspace, under Window, these are all of the palettes here. And if I turn them on and off, you can see which ones are checked and which ones are visible. So right now, Layers is showing up here, and you can see that it's checked. If I were to uncheck it, it will disappear. I can turn it back on by clicking Layers again, and so on and so forth. So you can also get rid of palettes if you don't need something. Let's say I will turn off color. We'll turn it back on in a second. But if I grab this and drag it out of the panel, it becomes a free-floating thing that I can put in another place or dock in a different area. I can also close it by just hitting the X, or I can turn it back on by going back to color and then redock it over where I like to keep it by swatches and transparency. So those are kind of where things are located. Now we'll run through quickly some general things in terms of the tools, and talk a little bit about rulers and guides and ways that you can start to transform things and move things around in a very controlled way. I would recommend always being very precise with how you want to do things in Illustrator or in any drawing program. The more precise you are in your process, the less, the cleaner your file is going to be, the better your outcome is going to be, and the less work you're going to have to do in terms of cleanup later on. So if we run through a couple of different things, in the tool palette, there are two different types of selection tools. So I'm going to just quickly create a rectangle and give it a color so that we have something to work with. We'll get back to making shapes in a minute. But if I have a shape, I can select it or with one of two different types of selection tools. So the left-hand one, the black arrow, is called the selection tool, and the right one, the white one, is called the direct selection tool. You'll see if I hover over these two or any other tools, it'll give me what's called a tooltip, which is a little pop-up that says the name of the tool. And behind the name of the tool in parentheses, if that tool has a shortcut, it will tell you what that shortcut is. So if I'm in the direct selection tool and I want to switch over to the selection tool, I can just hit V and it'll switch over to that tool. The only time this doesn't work is when you're using the type tool, because as you might imagine, if you type a letter or a number, when you're using the type tool, it will include it in the text rather than think of it as a shortcut. So the difference between these two is pretty important to understand. And I'm going to turn this into a little bit of a thicker line just so that you can see it a little bit more clearly. So with this shape or anything that this is just standing in for anything that you will have in Illustrator that you're working with, you can see, hopefully see that there are a series of points and a series of lines. So these are called paths, and these are called points. And depending on how you select something, you're selecting either the object as a whole or one or more of those parts. So with the direct selection tool, you click on any part of the object and you're selecting the whole thing. So if I move it around, if I scale it, if I rotate it, if I do anything to it, it's operating, that movement or that effect is operating on the entire object. If I select it, however, with the direct selection tool, it's allowing me to choose one or more parts of the object. So if I select the corner with the direct selection tool, I can move just that corner. If I select a line, I can move just that line, and so on and so forth. This is an important distinction to make as we go forward, just so that you know how to select things. I'm going to make a couple of additional shapes just so that we have a few things to look at here. And just to talk about how you add and subtract from selections. So if I am in the selection tool and have one thing selected, and then I decide that I want to have something else joining that, I can either hold down Shift and add to that selection. So now I've held down Shift and clicked on the second object, and now they're both selected, and I can edit both of them together. I can select additional objects. I can also subtract from the selection by holding down Shift. So if something is selected, I can subtract from it by, again, holding down Shift without deselecting everything and re-choosing the objects that I want to select. I'm going to turn these into a series of colors just so that we can look at stack orders. So you can see, since we have multiple objects, you can put them on, quote unquote, on top of each other, and depending on what order they were drawn in, they will build up from the back to the front. So I drew the red square first, the one that was manipulated, and then I drew the green one and then the blue one on top of it. If I want to change that order, I can use the arrange commands. So under object, there's arrange, and it allows you to bring things all the way to the front, bring them to the front one step or one object at a time, or send them to the back or send them backwards. So the shortcuts for these are Command and the bracket tools, or Command Shift and the bracket tools. So let's look at what that does. So if I want to bring this red parallelogram or four-sided shape up to the front, I can either step it up to the front one layer or shape at a time. So by holding down Command and the close bracket tool, or close bracket button, I can bring it one step at a time. I can hold down Command Shift and do the open bracket and send it all the way to the back, or I can, again, without Shift selected, so just Command and then the bracket tools, move things up and back in the stack order, basically. We'll get into layers in a future tutorial, but for now, know that this same stacking is true both of objects within a layer and then also of layers themselves. So just as a quick demonstration, if I add an additional layer and make that the active layer and draw something else on that layer, and let's give it a yellow color, so you can see they're on two different layers. So on two different layers, if I want this yellow rectangle to go all the way to the back, every time, I can press Command Shift open bracket as many times as I want, but it's not going behind anything else because it only is adjusting that order within its own layer. If I wanted to put it behind the objects, the same is true in terms of the stack of the layers as the objects within them. So I would need to move that layer below what's layer 1 that has the red, green, and blue shapes on it. So that's how you would start to make adjustments in that way. I'm going to go ahead and delete this layer because we don't need that now. So those are the orders. We've talked about selecting and deselecting. Let's talk a little bit about the properties of shapes and objects. And these properties, obviously you're not going to be making a composition that looks anything like this, but these are the things that we're talking about apply to all different types of forms. So when you have an object selected in the toolbar over on the left, you can see that there's what's called a fill and a stroke. And so the fill is basically what color the object is filled with, and the stroke is what color the outline of the object is. And you can control what colors they are or lack thereof. So this is a solid fill. I can change it to a transparent fill, in which case I can put it over top of other shapes and you can see through them. And I can also have it have a stroke, or I can change the color of the stroke, and I can also have it have no stroke. So these are things that you'll be adjusting constantly. You can flip the fill and the stroke. So if I want what was the fill to be the stroke, I can flip those back and forth, and so on and so forth. If you so Control Z is undo. So I'm just going to undo back to the point where I have a fill and a stroke. Control Shift Z is redo. So I can step back and forth in the kind of history of all the things that I'm doing in a project. And again, those are important ones to know. So Control Z and Control Shift Z. So if I don't want this to be red anymore, I can change the color of it in a couple of different ways. There are swatches that show up, so kind of basic colors. You can see these are the CMYKs, kind of reddest red, yellow, green, blue. And then there are a series of kind of gradients of those colors. White and black are in here too. Sometimes white is called paper in some of the other Adobe programs. But if I have the object selected, whichever of the fill or stroke is on the top of the tool is the one that's going to be changed. So if the red is on the top, the fill is on the top, and I come over to swatches, I can click on any of the other colors and it will change the fill to whatever color that is. I can also, in here where it has the fill and the stroke, in the swatches palette, I can switch those back and forth in here. And if I don't want one of these preset colors, I can double click on the fill itself here, and it'll bring up a color picker that allows me to choose any color within the range of 0 to 100% black, or light to dark, of any of the colors within the kind of rainbow. So I'm going to keep it on blue. And then I want to switch over to the stroke, and I can change that also to any color. Oops, sorry. Change that also to any color, or change it to none. In this case, I'm going to keep it on black. And then to make the width of that line, or what's called the stroke of the line, bigger or smaller, there's a palette called Stroke down here. If ever your palettes are not showing as many options as mine are, or if ever you're looking for options that are not showing that we talk about. So I'm going to pull this up here so you can see it. So if you have a stroke palette that just looks like this, that just has a weight in it, anytime there's these, 3 or 4 horizontal lines over to the right of something, it means that there are options to either show or hide. So if I click Show Options, you can see all of the other types of information that I can adjust relative to the stroke. So selected the object, it has a stroke color shown, but I want to make that a much thicker line. So I'm going to change the weight of the line to something like 10. And then I can make a lot of other types of adjustments as well. We'll get into these more later, but just so you know for the moment, if you're having trouble getting something to turn out the way that you want, the caps change different aspects of the appearance of something, and I'm going to zoom into the corners so that you can see. The way that the corner works changes depending on which option you have set, and where the line is, as it moves from this kind of infinitesimally thin line that is representing the path. As you make that stroke wider and wider, you can tell it that you want the width of that to be centered on the path, you can have it set to the inside, or you can have it set to the outside. So those are all levels of precision that you want to be able to control depending on what you're trying to do with the object. Another thing that you can do, although this probably won't happen so much right now, or you won't need to use this so much right now, is change something to a dashed line. When you do that, if you have your options open, there's a couple of quick things to take note of. There are a preset dash and gap, and then there are options for you to override that. So if I zoom out a little bit, you can see that the dash is really wide and the gap is really small. If I want to equalize those, I can change this to something that is the same dash and gap. I think because I have that set, there we go. Because if I want to change those into something that has a different dash and gap, I can do that down here. I can make these, 16 and 8, so twice as wide dash, half as wide gap. I can change it so that it's something different after that, right? So I can adjust all of the different ways that the line is working. I can also, and this is working a little bit funkily because I've got such a heavy line weight, but I can also turn things into kind of dotted lines in a certain extent by adjusting the cap type on the end of it. So if I were to make these 10 actually, so if I were to make the dash the same weight as the weight of the line, you'll see that they now become, I'm going to make the spacing in between them larger, and I'm going to get rid of these. It will, or it should, there we go. It will allow, if I change this to 0 and then I change the gap to control the spacing between, it will turn basically the dash into something that's just 2 caps on either side, so it looks like a dotted line. So just kind of a quick trick to override some of these things. So let's turn off dashed. So those are lines. Another thing that you want to be able to know how to do, I've been doing it with shortcuts, I'm sorry I didn't mention it earlier, is how to move around in the drawing. So there's a few shortcuts for how big or small the zoom is. Command 0 will zoom to the extents of the page. Command 1 will zoom to 100% view. So the way that you're seeing something should equate to the same resolution. It won't be necessarily the same exact size, but it's the same resolution that you would see the item when it's printed. And then you can use Command and the plus and minus keys to zoom in and out step by step. You can also hold down Shift, and that will allow you to then, with your mouse, pan. So if I want to move something side to side or up and down or kind of pan around in the object or in the drawing, I can use that. So again, Command 0 zooms to the page. Command 1 zooms to 100% scale view. Command plus zooms in by a step and over again. Command minus zooms out by a step. And then space allows you, and the use of your mouse allows you to pan. The last thing that I want to talk a little bit about is, before we move on to the second tutorial, is rulers and guides. So I mentioned earlier, precision, and the idea that you want to try to be very precise about things. There's a couple ways that Illustrator helps you do that, and we'll go into some of them a little bit later on. But for now, let's talk about guides and grids. So in your rulers, if you have those turned on, and again, if you don't have them turned on, it's Command R, turns them on and off. When they're on, if you put your mouse over the ruler and click and drag, you'll see kind of a vertical line start to scale across my page. And if I let go of my mouse, it'll drop a guide at that location. So this kind of cyan blue line is a guide. It's a non-printing element. It's something that's used for organization and kind of arrangement of things. If I right-click on the rulers, I can make sure that I can make sure that I'm in the right increment of dimensions, so I'm in inches. And then under object, under view, if I have guide, if I come down here to guides, I can unlock or lock the guides, and I can also hide or show them. So right now I'm going to unlock them so that I can move this guide around, and now I can grab it with my mouse and pull it side to side. I can also, in the transform dialog box, excuse me, I can select it and type in where I want it to be located. So right now, it is located at, there's a reference point grid here that's 9 points that says, do you want to refer to dimensions from the top left, the middle, top, and so on and so forth. So if I change it to the top left, I can see then that my guide is 1.2786 inches from the left-hand side of the page. It doesn't have a width because it extends beyond. It's kind of an infinitely long line in the vertical direction. I can click into that X dimension box though and type in if I want it to be exactly at an inch, or if I want it to be 2.5 inches. I can type in exactly where I want that guide to be. And so I can both have the guide in a very precise place, but also be able to move things relative to it and use the guide to line up objects. So in addition to the guides under view, there are a couple of options. One is called Smart Guides. That's a way that Illustrator tries to assist you in aligning things or moving things to the place where it thinks you want them. So if I start moving these shapes around, it will look for similarities or look for alignments and show me with these kind of pink lines. If I'm trying to line the center of these two objects up, it says basically, okay, they're now currently in alignment. If I'm trying to line up the bottom of one with the top of the other. So you can see, by adjusting this, can move things around and see where it's starting to try to align things. That may become annoying to you. It depends on what I'm working on, whether I have it on or not. But the way that you would turn it off is just by clicking on Smart Guides. And now when I move things around, it's not showing me those kind of pink tracking boxes. You do want to make sure that you are using guides to be able to snap to. So if I have an object and I don't have the smart track on, I want to make sure that I turn them on so that I can align things with them. I can also, if I want to, in the same way that I can move guides around, I can also use the transform dialog box to locate this object or resize the object. So right now the X and Y dimensions are showing me where the top left corner of this square or rectangle, is located relative to the top left corner of the page. So if I want it to be, right now it's at 2.5 because I'm aligning it with my guide. If I want it to be at 2 inches and I want it to be 2 inches down from the top of the page, I can type that into the transform dialog box and make that adjustment. In here you can also, as a quick kind of preview, you can also change the size of things. There's a kind of a chain here that allows you to keep the proportion of the object the same. So if I were to make the width of it 4 instead of 3.7 something, it's going to automatically adjust the height so that they're proportionally connected. If I want to change them so that they're not proportionally constrained, I can unclick the link and then I can change it to something that doesn't scale down with the other dimension. So guides, and then lastly grids. So under view, you can turn on the grid, which is basically again a non-printing background reference, and you can tell whether you want it to snap to the grid. So instead of, I'm going to turn off my guides, which is Command and then colon, the colon key, and I'm going to zoom in, and I can use, if I have the snap to grid on, I can use that to help me make adjustments with the object. Okay. So those are some of the basic interface and ways of moving around within Illustrator.